Welcome to the Tournament Poker Edge podcast, brought to you by TournamentPokerEdge.com, the only podcast dedicated exclusively to poker tournament strategy. Now here's your host, Clayton Fletcher.
Hello once again, everybody, and welcome to the Tournament Poker Edge podcast. I'm your host, Clayton Fletcher, on the road in beautiful Ohio, doing some comedy out here, and took a chance to record a podcast here in my hotel room in beautiful Cleveland. I love Cleveland. Anyway, want to thank you guys for all the recent comments. Seems like people really enjoyed the interview with T-Twist, Tim Kelly, his triumphant return to the podcast and to the TPE world. It was great catching up with him, and I really enjoyed our conversation. I'm so glad you guys did too. A lot going on in poker lately. Typically, after the main event, there's a bit of a quiet period. It seems like this year that quiet period just didn't happen. I mean, right away we have this interesting case we're going to talk about a little bit before I get into a few hands that I played in the main event this year. I want to talk a little bit about this lawsuit against our 7th place finisher at that final table. Also, kind of look into some other stuff that's going on around poker. Bryn Kenny, just a beast, calling his shot is a beautiful thing. Yeah, that man is sick. He doesn't care too much about minimizing his variance, obviously, and he's willing to bet on himself, and I respect anyone who's willing to bet on himself or herself. Yeah, actually, let's start with Bryn, my fellow New Yorker, or at least a native New Yorker. Bryn Kenny, I think he's 32 years old, maybe. He is now number one on the all-time live tournament money list. He basically took an insane amount of action on himself heading into the event. Instead of selling action and trying to minimize his variance in the largest buy-in in history, £1 million or something these guys spent to play in this Triton poker event. I'm sure you guys know the event that I'm talking about. He actually took more action and bet on himself, tweeting out that he wanted as much action as he could get, and he took about $1 million worth in the days leading up to the event. It's incredible. So Bryn Kenny now with $55.7 million in career live earnings, and that does not include the side action he had on himself, which is absolutely insane. So congrats to Bryn Kenny on that unbelievable accomplishment and on having unbelievable confidence to boot. Now let's talk about the other big story that's going on, and this is a very unpleasant situation. Gentleman by the name of Nick Marchington, whom I have never met. He's 21 years old. He's from England, and he has a lot to learn about life. He had sold a package, as the story goes, and I'm not involved in this, so I cannot speak to the facts of the matter. That's up to a court of law to decide. But from what I understand and from what's been reported throughout the media, he sold a package wherein you could get action on him in 2 World Series of Poker events, one of which was the main event and one of which is one of the side events. And he had a organization back him known as Sea Biscuit Staking. Love the love the name They are well known. What should you call them? A conglomerate, right? Of backers. They work together as a team, and they back a lot of players. And they backed Mr. Marchington, who, as we now know, finished in 7th place out of 8,569 players and cashed for over $1.5 million. So Nick Marchington apparently had canceled his deal with Seabiscuit Poker Staking because he was having a rough series prior to the main event and got a better offer. So apparently the markup originally was 1.2, and then someone else offered him 1.5, so he canceled his deal and told Seabiscuit Poker Staking that he was not going to play the main event at all. So he got out of his arrangement with them, then used this other backer to put him into the main event at much higher markup. That's a pretty slimy thing to do. First off, let's address this from both sides. Now, I don't have a horse in this race. I am not a backer of this player, and I don't know anything about him that I haven't told you already. But let's just look at this behavior on its own merits objectively. If you have a deal with someone, you shouldn't be backing out of that deal just because somebody else makes you a better offer. It's entirely possible that Mr. Marchington would not have even made the trip to Las Vegas had it not been for his backing deal, courtesy of Seabiscuit Poker Staking. So it's unclear to me, at least, whether this other offer came in after he canceled with them, telling them he did not plan to play the main event at all, or whether he told them that falsely so that he would be able to get the better deal. So the timeline's a little bit suspect, but to me, regardless, if you back out of a deal with someone and you give them that excuse, if you then later decide to play the event, I think the proper thing to do would be to go back to Seabiscuit Poker Staking and offer them the opportunity to get the piece of your action that they originally had purchased. Apparently it gets a little bit cloudy because evidently they accepted the money back for that part of their agreement. And so basically, as far as Nick was concerned, he was off the hook and again, a free agent. But if they accepted that money back with the understanding that he would not be playing the event, that's one thing. But if he did so under false pretenses just so that he could get a better price from another backer, I think that's slimy at best. Although probably not illegal, unless there are facts in this case that we don't know yet. If they don't want to get out of the deal, they should not have accepted the refund. And as I understand it, they did that. So let's look at things from their side as well. I think when a backing deal like this goes wrong or something happens that's unexpected, I believe that it's kind of scummy to go after the person you backed, basically free-rolling him. They had allegedly bought a 10% piece, which was refunded, but their stance is that it was refunded with the understanding that Marchington would not play the main event. So then he goes on to play the main event, but now they're trying to get 10% of his winnings, which, in my opinion, is scummy. I think that both parties are being kind of scummy here, and I generally stay out of backing situations. How many times on this podcast even have we talked about this backing situation? I remember the Kate Hall controversy and others that, just so many things can go wrong. I think it's smart to only do business with people you know. And what I prefer to do is just say to some of my close friends, especially those who are better at poker than I am. How about we swap pieces in this tournament or that tournament, because it's much easier to keep track of the winnings and the payouts and all of that. I don't know how well they knew Mick Marchington, but I doubt that they'll be interested in doing much further business with him. It should be interesting, I should say, to see how this lawsuit turns out for everyone involved. But it's kind of a sad story because it's getting probably more attention right now than the winner of the main event. Our new champion is probably a name that fewer people know than Nick Marchington, who finished in 7th place, which just proves that bad news travels much faster than good news. So yeah, most people can name Gary Gates just because he's poker adjacent and of his long-standing relationship with Poker Stars. I've actually met Gary Gates on a number of occasions. I'm so excited for him. He was, of course, the 4th place finisher in this year's main event. He was instrumental in arranging the show that we did in the Bahamas, we being Joe Stapleton, Norm MacDonald, and myself. So Gary Gates did a lot of good things. He's a great businessman. He treated us all with the utmost respect and really went out of his way to make sure that it was a good experience for the performers as well as the audience, which very often people who have hired me as a comedian, they don't do that, to say the least. So I love that Gary Gates won a ton of money this summer. I'm happy for our 1st place finisher. I am also very irritated by this story, and I feel like regardless of who ends up winning in the court battle, it's a shame that these are the kind of poker stories that end up making it into the mainstream media because they kind of make us all look bad like a bunch of cheats. Okay, one other topic very quickly before I give you guys a little strategy from a few hands that I played on day 2 of this year's WSOP main event. I want to briefly touch on the Major League Baseball bet that I have with David Tuckman. Norman Chad has a much smaller version of the same bet. Will the Orioles win over 58.5 games this season? I'll be honest, guys. A month ago, it looked like there was very, very little chance. And now the Orioles have had a great month of July. They went 12-12, which for a team that's expected to lose over 100 games, to have any month of 500 baseball is unbelievable. And now, with 50 games to go, the Orioles only need to win 20 of those 50 for me to cash my ticket versus Mr. Tuckman, who has been on his own podcast talking about how he plans to spend the money that he's going to win from me and others. So I hope that the Orioles can continue their winning ways and teach David Tuckman the lesson. Do not count your chickens before they hatch, or your Orioles, as the case may be. So, I mean, look, do I think the Orioles will win 20 of their next 50 games? I think that would be quite an accomplishment for this team because they are historically bad. But it looked like they were going to need to win half their games a while ago. So because they had such a good July, anything is possible. And I know you guys mostly don't care about this, but those who do are rooting for me. And so I appreciate that so very much. All right, so let's talk poker, shall we? In the World Series of Poker main event, I finished day 1 with 58,000 chips. The problem is this year we started with 60,000 chips. So as we discussed over a month ago now, my day 1 was less than stellar, but I was not at all panicked about that because the structure of the main event is such that really just surviving day 1 with any type of stack is totally fine. I started day 2 with an M of 30 or something like that. You know, we were just fine. It wasn't a short stack situation. I wasn't in a desperate push and pray mode or anything like that. And I did quite well in the first hour. Things were just kind of moving along swimmingly. And the next thing I knew, I had 100,000. So that's where we're going to begin now. It's early on day 2 of the main event. The blinds are 400 and 800 with an 800 ante. And we have about 100,000. Now, before the day began, we Googled our opponents. And now let's talk about doing this, because I don't know how many of you guys are playing live events where you have multiple starting days. But generally speaking, the information is released at the latest the night before of who you will be playing against on the next day's action. So in the case of the main event, because there's an entire day 1C, and I actually played day 1A this year, so I got to wait out day 1B and 1C. So by the time day 1C rolled around, I knew exactly who from day 1A and day 1B would be at my day 2AB table, if that makes sense. And what I'll do is I will look at those players online. You can Google them. You can go to Hendon Mob and just get a feel for who they are, what kind of tournaments they normally play. Now, of course, you can see someone's all-time live tournament winnings, but that only gives you a small taste of what, that's only a small piece of the puzzle. Yeah, so if a player has $500,000 in live tournament winnings and 480,000 of it is from last year's main event, and the rest of the tournaments that player has played in his life were in the $300 to $500 buy-in range, you can pretty much count on that player being a $300 player or $500 player. What I mean by that is I wouldn't expect a GTO strategy from that player or some incredibly sick bluff a few minutes before the bubble burst on day 3. Like, these are the kind of things you want to look for. What types of tournaments does this player normally play? And does he or she travel for poker? If you see that a player has cashes on 4 continents in 5 years, you could pretty much assume that's a full-time professional player who is out there trying to find the highest value live tournaments all the time. If, on the other hand, a player has 300,000 in cashes and they're all from the same locals casino in Florida or Delaware or wherever else people have local casinos, you can rest assured that that player is used to a certain type of poker, which is whatever type of poker is generally played in that person's hometown. Well, Clayton, why is all this important? Because you need to be able to evaluate who is just so excited to be here in the main event and to have made day 2, and who is serious about trying to win this bracelet, because the playing styles and the decisions that players will make will vary greatly depending on the answers to those questions. For some of your opponents in the main event, cashing in that tournament would be one of the biggest accomplishments in his or her life. And for some of your opponents in the main event, min cashing would be considered a failure. So you need to know who's there with you. And what I'll do is, what country does this player come from? Where has this player earned money in tournament poker? When he or she has cashed, is it generally final tables, deep in the money, or are there a lot of min cashes? These answers will help you determine how best to play against your opponents. What country someone is from. There are some countries where the players tend to play a certain style. If someone is from Brazil or Israel, I assume that the player is going to be extremely loose and extremely aggressive. Are there players from those countries who don't fit that mold? Of course there are. But given no other information other than a player's country of origin, I will take those things seriously and assume that unless proven otherwise. You need to make snap judgments in a game of incomplete information, and that is one thing that I go on a lot. If a player comes from Sweden or Norway, I generally assume that he or she will be very good, very aggressive, very fearless, and understand the math, because those are countries where the school systems teach math extremely well and all the students get free college. So anyone you meet from Sweden or Norway is likely to have been college educated, as why not? It's free. So all those things combined kind of make it likely that you're generally up against a tough opponent if you have a Scandinavian at your table. Are there terrible players from Sweden? Of course there are. Do some of them play a tight and scared style? Of course they do. I'm speaking generally. I cannot emphasize that enough. So I had done that with my opponents. We're going to get back to the hand now. And I had determined that because when I was in the hijack or the cutoff, my opponents, for various reasons, in the blinds, would be likely to call. So I had pre-made a decision prior to even meeting my opponents that, unless proven otherwise, I was not planning to steal the blinds from the hijack or the cutoff based on the player profile that I put together using the circumstantial and incomplete information that I had at my disposal. Now, some of you might listen to this and say, that's ridiculous. How can you make a snap judgment about your opponents before you even see them or meet them just based on their Hendon Mob results and other information you can find about them online? To that, I would say, I've been doing this for many years, and I'd say my batting average is around 800 in correctly predicting who's going to be wild, who's going to be tight, who's going to be loose, and what types of mistakes they're going to make. I'm very seldom shocked by the behavior of opponents that I've profiled using this method. Obviously, this is anecdotal evidence. I can't prove that it will work for you, but I can tell you it's worked for me so well that I actually put a lot of stock in my ability to make these determinations ahead of time. So that said, I am not planning to steal blinds when I'm in the hijack or the cutoff. So in this hand, it's folded to me in the hijack. And if I had peeked down at a junk hand, I would have thrown it away. But I peeked down at a king and a queen. King, queen offsuit, the king of spades, and the queen of hearts. So the blinds were 400, 800, and 800. Now you might think that the standard play here would be to open to 1800 or 1600 or 1700. I went 2300. And the reason why is because, as I said before, I'm expecting to get action. And I'm expecting to get very loose action from the blinds. So, for that reason, I make it bigger, because when you want action, you might as well want a bigger pot as well when you're going to be in position. So I bet 2,300, almost 3 times the big blind, with king queen from the hijack. I have about 100,000 in my stack, and the blinds are fairly deep, in the 60 to 80 range themselves. I get called unexpectedly by the shortest stack at the table, who was an Indonesian amateur, as far as I could tell. No big cashes, just a few small, what looked like local cashes in small Asian tournaments. His stack was 32,000. So he has 40 big blinds, an M of 16. So I was surprised to see him call, because he had been so tight thus far. and because he had been mostly staying out of it. The big blind, who was a French player that I was fully expecting to be loose before I met him, and then when I did meet him, I noticed that he was involved in probably 50% of the hands that were played at our table in the first hour and a half or so. So, a little bit of confirmation there of my pre-read, if you will. But yeah, so I get these two callers, a tight player in position on my left, and the big blind, of course, out of position on my right. So three of us see the flop. There is 8,100 now in the pot. And Hero holds the King of Spades, Queen of Hearts. Flop is 9 of diamonds, Trey of spades, Deuce of spades. So 9 Trey Deuce with 2 spades. We missed, except that we have 2 overcards and backdoor flush possibilities to the king. Also some nebulous backdoor straight possibilities, but unless it's a jack or a 10, that's going to be out the window on the turn. The French player checks to me, and I'm not really comfortable with betting here, even though it's a beautiful flop that is unlikely to have hit either of my opponents. It's unlikely to have hit the big blind just because even the worst player doesn't call a 3x open with a lot of trays or deuces in his hand. So if he doesn't have a 9, he probably missed. Doesn't mean he's going to fold to my flop bet, by the way. This is a loose French player. And French loose is a little bit looser than the loose that you might be used to. The problem is the Indonesian player on my left, who has been very uninvolved in the tournament so far, has called me pre-flop despite my large raise sizing. So he's basically announced that he's got a hand. But what kind of hand would he have? Do you think a player who is playing in his first main event and doesn't have over 20,000 in lifetime cashes and has probably never played a 10K in his life is going to slow play on day 2 if he's got a big pair and a player has opened to almost 3x? I just don't see such a player flat calling on the button with 40 big blinds, M of 16, however you want to look at his stack. I think the fact that he flatted rules out, for the most part, those really big pairs. I don't expect this player to try anything tricky like that. I expect him to play his hands mostly straightforwardly. So I kind of, underweighted the possibility that he had a big pair. And I thought that most of his range should be small to medium pairs. We're talking pocket fives country here. So if I bet, I need to know that he's likely to call me with that range. He could also have a hand like ace-jack that didn't know what to do and felt like it was a little too strong to fold, but didn't want to re-raise. It wasn't strong enough for that, so just called as a compromise, which, of course, our friend Andrew Brokus says you're not supposed to do, but I think we all do it from time to time. So he does have some 2 high card type of hands in his range as well, with his pre-flop call. So to bet or not to bet, I'm not comfortable betting, but I also am not comfortable checking because it's just such a great flop for the pre-flop raiser's range. 9 trade deuce, I feel like doesn't hit my opponents at all. And so I will usually have the best hand in this spot with all of my ace highs and obviously with all of my pairs. And I also think that I have a lot of cards on the turn that would allow me to fire a second barrel and continue telling my story that I have a big pair. So this is a close decision. And I don't often continuation bet into two opponents. And I don't often bet continuation bet when one of my opponents is incredibly loose, as my big blind opponent is in this hand. But in this spot, I decided to give myself a good price to possibly take it down. And I bet 3,000 into 8,100. And you can quarrel with that if you want to. I think it is a very questionable bet. And I have quarreled with it myself since I made it. I don't think it's a terrible play, but I just think this is a spot to probably check, give up. Anyway, I did bet 3,000. My Indonesian opponent called rather quickly, and then the French player thought about it for a while in the big blind, maybe about 20 to 30 seconds, which is pretty long. And then he also called. So now our pot is 17,000, and I still have two opponents, and I only have king high, and I'm sure it's no good. Great. Great job, Clayton. The turn is the 8 of diamonds. So now our board is 9 trade deuce with 2 diamonds and 2 spades. 9 trade deuce 8 with the 9-8 of diamonds and the trade deuce of spades. Frenchie checks, and I need to decide what to do. Well, here's the thing. The French player kind of flinched a little bit when the 8 hit. Not like I thought he loved it or something, but I thought that it was a card that he was fairly happy to see. Now, that could mean a lot of things. Did it give him a flush draw? Did it possibly give him a pair of 8s somehow? I mean, would this player have called my flop bet with an 8 in his hand on 9 trade deuce? Actually, you can't put anything past him. This guy was freaking loose, folks. So I didn't know what to read, how much weight to put on the fact that I noticed he seemed to like the 8, and that maybe he considered even betting that card himself, which again, he might do with a draw, holding something like 6-5. I don't know. Does the set, now he's got a double gutter with 6-5. I don't know. Like there are some hands that are improved by that 8 that I'm still beating, is what I'm saying. Jack 10, right? But does that hand call me on the flop? Sometimes, yeah, because he's loose French guy. So anyway, I thought he wanted to bet it. I was already disappointed that I had gotten action on my left from the Indonesian player. So I decided to check. And the button checked quickly behind me. So at that point, I didn't feel there was any chance that the Indonesian player had a strong hand. By strong, I mean a 9 or better, which means we could pretty much squarely put him on something like pocket 5s, or possibly some type of spade draw with like maybe a ace jack of spades, right? I mean, I have the king of spades, so there aren't that many such hands. I just felt like, most of his range here is going to be something like pocket 5s. And his quick check gave away a lot of information there, I thought. So that card checked through, and there's still 17,000 in the pot. And the river is a jack of diamonds. So our final board is 9 trade deuce, 8 jack, now with 3 diamonds. So backdoor diamonds came in. And there's now a possible flush and a possible straight flush, to be exact, with the 9, 8, and jack, all of diamonds. I don't get the same vibe from our French opponent on the river. His body language looked disappointed to see the jack. I did not think that he was acting or aware of the fact that I was watching him. And when he checked, I felt that he tried to do so in a way that was designed to make me think that he had a big hand. In other words, it was an intimidating looking check, if there is such a thing. So I put a lot of stock in that read because his demeanor was so different on the river than it was on the turn. So I felt like there could be a chance to bluff him. We still have to worry about the Indonesian player. And what made me decide to fire here, and I feel like a lot of the hands that I've been discussing with you guys on the podcast as far as my main event were bluffs and whether they were wise or not. But the reason why I decided to fire here was because I thought the Indonesian player gave away the strength of his hand on the turn by checking quickly. And I did not want to let him win this pot with just a pair of fives. I'm sure my king queen is no good on the flop when I get callers, two callers like that. It's very hard to range the French guy, as it's always hard to range your loosest opponents, right? But all things considered, I was pretty sure that the Indonesian player, who again started the hand with only 32,000 and now has put in 2,300 pre-flop and 3,000 more on the flop, and was very happy to not put any more in on the turn, I didn't think that he could call a big bet here on the river. So with 17,100 in the middle on this river, Hero, that's me, bets 14,000. Why so big? Because I'm representing a big hand. I need to make the bet here that I would make if I had made a straight flush somehow on this river, or any flush for that matter. I think it's extremely unlikely that either of my opponents went runner, diamonds, even though I don't have a diamond in my hand. I also don't think that either of them could have Queen 10, because first of all, how does Queen 10 ever call the flop? Even the loosest player doesn't call this flop with just Queen 10. Also, I have a queen in my hand anyway. So I might not be blocking the flush, but I am blocking the straight. And, or at least one of the possible straights here. Let me see. Is there, yeah. The 10-7 is also a straight that I don't block. But again, does that hand ever call the flop? I don't think so. Possibly 10-7 of spades, but hey, we can't worry about everything, right? So, putting all this together, and the truth is, I seldom bluff into two opponents, particularly when one of them is extremely loose. But the very specific set of circumstances that presented themselves here inspired me to seize the moment, as we say, and go for it. Now, this is not a line that most bluffers take. Bet the flop, check the turn, and bet the river. So that might give more credibility to the fact that I'm supposed to have something here. But particularly against the French player, I felt it was necessary to go big or go home. In other words, I'm getting looked up every time if I just bet like a normal size, like 55 or 6,000 into 17. He's calling that with whatever he called with on the flop. 14,000 is a little bit harder for him to just look me up and keep me honest. So they do fold. And, then I commented when I recorded this hand for my own purposes during the break that ensued shortly thereafter. That was a skill hand. Kind of tongue-in-cheek, because some of these bluffs that I made in this year's main event, I still don't know whether they were good plays or not. This one worked, but let's not be results-oriented, guys. Do you think this is a good play? I'd love to get your thoughts on that one. All right, let's do one more hand before we wrap up this episode. Kind of a fun one. Same blind level, and it's very close to the break. Let's see. yeah, at this point, I had about 120,000 in my stack, and I had most of my table covered, which is always a pleasant feeling when you're in the main event and your stack is the largest at your table. Obviously, that's a good feeling. So there was one other player, I think, that had more, maybe. But yeah, I had pretty much a chip lead at my table. Two players limped in, which is unusual but not unheard of nowadays. And I was in the cutoff holding 6-6. We're still at the 4-8 level. The limpers have decent sized stacks, 60 to 70,000. And of course, I have about 120. So I call with pocket sixes. If you told me that you like to raise in these spots and build the pot, especially in position, convince the button that he needs to fold, and that you like to raise with your small, medium pairs like 5, 6s, 7s, that's fine if that's what you want to do. It will be easier for me to get stacks in if I raise now and flop a set. If we flop a set, we're going to want to try to get stacks in. So raising now will help that happen. Right now, stacks are a little too big to comfortably get all in. And obviously, we're mostly playing this hand for set value. I decided to take what I think is the standard line and just call. So I become the third limper. The button folds, which is always nice. And the small blind folds, which I think is a mistake, regardless of his holding. That's a really tight fold. There is so much already in this pot that I think you should be calling with almost all your hands. At least see a flop. Given a ridiculously good price, in terms of pot odds. But he does fold. And then he must have patted himself on the back because the big blind made it, instead of checking and leaving it at 800, made it 4,000 with 60,000 behind. Now, this player is not the same big blind from the other hand. In that hand, I was in the hijack, and now I'm in the cutoff. So we're talking about a different player now. And this player was pretty straightforward, I would say. I didn't think that he would be balancing his range of hands that would make it 4,000 with bluffs as well as value. I think, like most players, he doesn't find a lot of bluffs from the big blind and is probably not trying to steal the limps here. So I thought I put probably an 80 to 90% chance that he had a big pair or ace king, the hands that most of us would have when we make it 4,000 usually. Of course, I can't rule out the possibility that he's going crazy with 10 deuce or jack 4 or a suited connector, but I just didn't think that was a big part of his range based on what I had noted from his previous play. The first limper calls and the second limper does not. So now I'm in position holding 6-6. Now the first limper had about 70,000 behind. The big blind, by the way, has another 60,000 behind after the 4K raise. So with that in mind, should we call another 3,200, closing the action to see a flop with our sixes? Or should we try another play like folding and not wanting to put in that much just to see the flop? Or really getting frisky and raising? Well, I think folding is a little too conservative, especially when someone else has already called, and especially knowing that we will see the flop if we just put in this 3,200. The implied odds of flopping a set and knowing that the big blind probably has a very strong hand. Probably aces, kings, ace, king, queens, maybe jacks, probably tens, but otherwise, okay, let's put ace, queen in there as well. right? But I think a lot of players would just check with nines and wouldn't want to build big pot with ace 10. Just check and see a flop. That can't be 100%. I can't be 100% sure that that's the exact range, but based on this player's previous behavior and my read on him in general, I didn't think that he had a lot of hands in his 4K range. I thought some hands might raise a smaller amount to build a pot, possibly even a hand as bad as ace 10, king queen possibly, but I don't think those hands would have made it 4,000. So I think it's a pretty easy call. I think that other plays I could argue against, but I think calling is right. So I call, and we do see a flop, and it's a flop we like. With 14,000 in the middle, the flop comes 10, 6, deuce with 2 diamonds. 10 of diamonds, 6 of diamonds, deuce of spades. Remember, hero holding the pocket sixes. So we have a set. It's always fun to flop a set in any tournament, but sets feel even better in the main event, believe me. The big blind, who had raised to 4,000 pre-flop, now bets 5,500 into the 14,000 pot. Now, let's assume he has a big pair. That's what I did at the time. I felt like there's no point in worrying about how he would play ace king now that the flop has come 10 high. So we might as well be optimistic and assume that our opponent has aces, kings, queens, something like that. Is he going to fold? Oh, I should mention the other player that was in the hand before has now folded. So the big blind bets 5,500. The other player folds and it's on me. If I raise, can he fold aces or kings? I think the answer is not yet. So with that in mind, I raised. And I raised to 13,000, fully expecting action. Now remember, this player starts the hand with 6,500. So at this point, I'm trying to think in my mind whether we should try to get all the chips or should we just try to bet amounts that will let him feel comfortable calling. I think in a cash game, my mentality would be, let's make a raise that will allow me to bet big on the turn and then shove the river and get all in. The reason why I differentiate between the way I play a hand like this in a cash game and the way I play in a major tournament is that in a cash game, it's not such a disaster if your opponent finds the fold. In a tournament, it is so important when you have a big hand to make sure you do accumulate chips, that it's actually worth sacrificing a little bit of EV just to have a higher batting average on getting called in those bets. And this is a concept that players that come from the cash game world often don't learn when they switch to tournaments. You need to get value for your big hands. It's disaster when I'm up against aces and somehow I allow this guy to get away. I need to make sure that he's going to call my bets, even if that means that I don't maximize my expectation in the long run. So in a cash game, all you care about is maximizing your expectation in the long run. In a tournament, there's a lot of value in just surviving, and there's also a lot of value in just making sure that you accumulate when you have a big hand. So with that in mind, I raised to 13,000, expecting action, and I got a call. I think in his shoes, he has to call with aces or kings, queens. There's just too many draws. Remember, it's 10 of diamonds, 6 of diamonds, deuce of spades. There are all kinds of gut shots available and flush draws with diamonds. There's also pure bluffs that I could have now that the other player folded. If the other player had called, I think my raise would be a lot stronger. Right? But since it's just he and I think there is a decent chance that I would bluff with certain hands. So in his shoes, he just has to call. The pot is now exactly 40,000, and the turn is the deuce of hearts, pairing the board and giving hero the full house. 10 of diamonds, 6 of diamonds, deuce of spades, deuce of hearts. And now he checks to me, and I bet 13,000 again. So clearly, I'm not trying to get stacks in the way I would have in a cash game. And this is what I was going for here. I want to make sure that I get called again. My opponent has to know there are some hands that I might play this way that he can beat. I can have an overpair myself. It's unlikely because I limped in and then just called a raise, but it's theoretically possible. More likely, I could have a 10 or a draw. If I have a 10 or a draw and he folds his aces or his kings, getting a good price, it's a huge mistake and one that I don't expect this player to make. He doesn't look happy when I bet 13,000. And I think that he felt like he was being milked. And in fact, he was. But I don't know. I don't know too many players that can get away from aces or kings here. And I really felt like that's what he should have a lot. So after a time, he calls. And now we have 6,600 in the middle. Our opponent has about 35,000 behind. And the river is the 4 of hearts. And he checks again. What a great river. 10, 6, deuce, deuce, 4. The flush did not come in. None of the straights came in except for 3, 5. I mean, okay. Yeah. It's a pretty clean board for my full house and a very clean board also for my opponent's supposed overpair. Now, this is what you want when you call that 4,000 pre-flop. To have your opponent get into a situation where he can't get away from an overpair. Now he checks. He's got 35 behind. It is reasonable to bet enough to put him all in, given that his stack is only about half the pot. I just think too many players in this particular tournament fold when they shouldn't. Like when they've already committed themselves to a pot with aces. I just think there are too many folds that they find. And I wanted to, again, ensure that I got paid. So I bet 17.5, about half my opponent's stack. And he looks completely agonized. Says out loud, I would fold if you shoved. Which doesn't make sense, but he said it. So I wanted to report that he said it. He thinks about it for quite a while, maybe 3 minutes. I think players at the table were starting to get antsy. He's taking so long. He says, I can't fold this hand. And he puts it in. And I turn over my set. He sees the bad news. And he says, I had aces. I'm pretty proud of this one. I'm sure that some of you will say that I should have gone for stacks to really maximize my EV. And I think that taking a more aggressive line, betting bigger, would actually maximize my EV. But I think it's more important to accumulate chips. And I know that I sacrificed some EV, namely the extra 17,500 that I did not win in this hand. By the way, my opponent ended up bagging a lot of chips. A lot of my opponents talked about how they were teasing him how I let him off easy or something like that, and that I could have gotten him earlier. I'd love to get your thoughts on that one. It was a time when I'm usually pedal to the metal, and I decided for very specific reasons to take a more conservative line, at least in terms of sizing, and just try to get those sure calls. I'd love to hear what you guys think about this hand, about these two hands. Also, feel free to share your thoughts on the controversy. It's just such a sad story. I really hate that staking story. I hate somebody trying to free roll somebody else. I hate players getting greedy when you should just be grateful that you have backers to begin with. Especially in the case of Nick, he only had like 20,000 in lifetime cashes. You're lucky you have a backer at all, buddy. You're 21 years old. You trying to get a better price? And by the way, who gives a 21-year-old British player with 20,000 in lifetime earnings 1.5 markup? I don't know. I want to find these backers. Maybe I'll start getting backers. Anyway, that's going to do it for this episode, guys. I hope that you enjoyed it. Please continue to tweet me at Clayton Comic. It's helpful if you include the Tournament Poker Edge Twitter as well. Obviously rate, review, leave a comment, leave a review. We love that stuff, and it really, really helps as far as building this podcast up and making it, helping us reach our goal of becoming the number one comedy. I just say comedy. How tired am I? I did 2 shows tonight. The number one poker podcast. But at least continue to download and listen and enjoy. So for everyone here at Tournament Poker Edge, I'm Clayton Fletcher. Thank you all so much for listening.
I wanna hold them like they do in Texas Plays. Fold them, let them hit me, raise it, baby, stay with me. Luck and intuition, play the cards with babes to start. And after she's been hooked, I'll play the one that's on her heart. Oh, whoa, 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 whoa. I'll get her heart, show her what I got. Oh, whoa, 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 whoa. I'll get her heart, show her what I got. Carry mine, no she can't read a mile. Hold the face, she's got to love nobody. Carry mine, no she can't read a mile. Hold the face, she's got to love nobody. Poker face, poker face. Poker face, poker face. I wanna roll with her, a hard pair we will be. While little gambling is fun when you're with me. I love it. Russian roulette is not the same without a gun. And baby, when it's love, it's not rough, it isn't fun.